Hindu religion is often very mythological. There's lots of stories and so on. And so, I thought, okay, Christianity is like that, right? As an atheist, I felt no need for. I didn't spend much time thinking about Jesus or Christianity or any of those. Science answered my questions, right? But again, dependent on the depth of my question. If science didn't answer those questions, it just said, "Here is the law. Here is the law of gravity." Well, why is there gravity, right? But at that point, as a atheist, I didn't think about that. Just that it answered a lot of my questions and it was logical. It wasn't till I met three people. All of them were extremely smart intellectually. One of them was a professor at Yale, one of them was a civil engineer, and one of them was a lawyer, right? So none of them are dummies, right? All of them trained to think very logically, and all of them were Christians, right? And I was shocked. It's like, I mean, to me, that was different from my atheistic world, you know? And so, but it got me curious enough to understand. I wonder why they are Christians, and let me give it a shot to say, uh, is there anything here?
Tell me if I get the basic plot points correct here. Raised in a Hindu family,
Correct.
raised totally saturated in that culture and in that religion, and then at some point in your life, that all begins to dissolve. And
Right.
through your studies and through your understanding of science and engineering, you find yourself into basically atheism. And my understanding is not necessarily intentionally, but just as a almost automatic byproduct of the lifespan development or something like that? Or how did
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah,
happen?
yeah. It was an automatic byproduct of getting to the age where I was into high school and college, and so there is somewhat of a questioning of the faith of our fathers, right? And to me, it didn't stand the test. I was surrounded by scientific atheists, and so I looked at it from that perspective and started looking at Hinduism and says, why am I worshiping idols? Right? We built this idol. Why am I worshiping something we built? Right? So then, once I started asking the questions and saying, why am I doing this? What does it actually stand for? What does this actually mean? I began to realize it was more of a cultural religion, right? We were all Hindus because we've always been Hindus. We grew up in this family and we were born this way, right? But it didn't stand up to my test of science to say what relevance does this have, first of all, to the world around me, right? And does it answer some questions I have in my mind, like where do we come from, where do we go, what is the origin of information in the cell, those kind of questions. There's simply no connection point between religion. So it's like, what is the point of that religion? I mean, the science seems to answer things a lot better than the.
Okay, so you became curious about basically the big questions of philosophy, and then you found that based on your upbringing and sort of the answers that were provided to you therein, you were not satisfied with what was given. And then were you initially satisfied by, or I guess just walk me through your trajectory in terms of your thinking. What, as your Hindu upbringing was dissolving and you were finding that science was offering you the answers that you were looking for, tell me
Right.
what specifically about like science and the connection between the science and the atheism that you're describing there. Tell me what was appealing and what was satisfying to you therein that was not within Hinduism.
Right. So I found science to be rational, right? I could look at empirical data, could do repeatable experiments, right? It was something, or it was based on logic, right? All of which interested me. I didn't think that much about the philosophical underpinnings of science. It's only later on I realized it was really based, or somewhere along the way, scientists had drifted off in the direction of atheism, right? Even though I would say the original underpinnings of science, as Stephen Meyer says, it is based on the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? And then the C.S. Lewis's famous thing, right? Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver, right? And so, but I was simply looking at the fact that it was empirical, it was logical, it was mathematical, and all of those appealed to me, right? And it was a way of looking at life, and it described the physical reality really well, right? So that's the first thing I saw about science. That's what attracted me to science. I'm still a scientist. I still like looking through that lens. So it was only when I chanced upon what is behind the science. Why do we expect science to be true, right? Then I started looking to see is a lot of them people who are drifting towards atheism, and that creates its own set of problems, right? And which I'm sure we'll get through as we go along here.
Well, I think it's interesting because I can't remember where, but I heard you say somewhere else on the internet that you said Christianity is an engineer's dream. And I
Yes.
think that that statement will strike people as very ironic or very jarring. I don't think that a lot of viewers of my channel will necessarily agree with that, but I also think that it raises a question. What do you mean by that? Why is Christianity an engineer's dream?
Well, I found Christianity to be rational. I was looking to describe reality, right? And so the three things that when I first started looking at Christianity, the three things which immediately struck me was the origin of the universe, right? Questions around the origin of the universe. First of all, nobody really thought the universe even had an origin until, we can talk about Einstein's general theory of relativity and how it led to the Big Bang and, the fact that there was an origin, right? And but to me, there's a philosophical argument to make for the Big Bang as well, and the philosophical argument is this: if we start today, right, and in physics we always would start right now is t equals zero, time equals zero, right? Can we move forward and get to time equals infinity, right? The answer is no, because infinity is a abstract mathematical term. It's not an actual number. We'll never hit infinity. No matter how high a number we hit, we can always go higher than that, right? So we cannot cross infinity. But if the universe did not have a beginning, right, then so it's been around forever. Somehow we've gone through infinite time to come to now, right? So that's obviously not possible, that we cannot have come to now by going through infinite amount of time. So the universe had to have a beginning. So this is not even a physical argument. This is a philosophical argument that the universe had to have a beginning. So then I started to see that there was a connection between the science part of it, the physics side part of it, and if there is an origin of the universe, why is there an origin? Why did it start? When did it start, right? Who started it off, right? And I began to realize that science is much better at asking how did it start, right? And getting off into explaining, internal energies and states and entropies and all of these other terms, but not answering the question, why did it start, right? And if I can use a simple analogy, right, of rocks versus rockets, right? If we are close to the cliff of a mountain and we see a rock fall off the mountain down the side of the mountain, you don't need a big explanation. A good physical explanation is perfectly fine. You say probably the soil around the rock eroded and nothing to support the rock, so it just fell down the side of the cliff, right? But if I say there's a spacecraft which was launched off a launching pad, a rocket goes up and it's up there now in exceeds the escape velocity of the Earth, and it's now becomes a communication satellite. There's certainly how it happened, but also why it happened. So somebody saw a way to monetize. Uh, Wi-Fi or communications, and someone actually launched a satellite. So there's a who as well,
Hmm.
and why it happened, and not just a how, right? So even in the scientific area, so I think those questions are valid. So I started thinking of the origin of the universe and said there must be an explanation which says who started it, And why did he or she or it start the universe? Right. That was the first thing that struck me about as I started looking at the science of it and saying there is some metaphysical explanations here we have to chase and not just physical explanations. Right. Um, the second thing which really interested me was the origin of life.
Actually,
Right.
really quick, Ganesh, if I may,
Yeah.
and I don't mean to interrupt,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
can I ask a clarifying question on origin of the universe before we go to origin of life?
Yes, please.
And that question would be, I've noticed the way that these conversations tend to go between atheists and believers is that essentially everything that a believer ends up saying uh, about God, those same traits basically get applied to the universe. Where if we were to say God is eternal, the response would be the universe is eternal. You sort of hear this play
Right.
itself out in that dialogue between Richard Dawkins and John Lennox. Who created your creator then,
Right.
Mr. Dawkins, and that whole idea. But with what you were saying about how we are in this moment now, therefore we know that eternity cannot go into the past. What if someone were to say, basically the same thing toward God? Does God exist now in this moment? Then does that mean that he also, isn't eternal or something like that, according to that lot? So you always kind of see this like it's the
Yeah.
universe, no, it's God. And I guess my question uh, is there something that you found to be ontologically or categorically different about what God is as compared to what the universe is that makes
Right.
him or she or
Great.
it, as you said, a more logical first thing
Right.
that is eternal and is, in a sense, mysterious and unexplained, as opposed to matter, space, and time
Right.
itself?
It's a phenomenal question. I'll take a shot at answering this. The universe as we think of it is really matter and energy, right? So when we say there was a beginning to the universe, that means before that there was no matter and no energy, right? So from that perspective, the universe could not have been eternal, because we didn't exist at some point, right? Now, when we come to God, um, and we actually look at the Big Bang and say how the universe was grew initially, you see evidence of somebody monkeying with the physics, so to speak, which leads us to this understanding of God, even outside of Christianity, that God is a personal being who had the ability, one, to start off the universe, right? So, that was it was actually shocking to me to realize that God is a person,
Hmm.
right? And so not only he could make the decision to start the universe, he monkeyed with the physics so the universe grew as he wanted it to grow.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is something the universe itself is not capable of doing, right? The universe doesn't make decisions, right? And it also talks about, it gives me a vision of God of being very smart. It is actually one of the first thing which struck me about God. Not even that he was personal, but that he was very smart. It's like here's someone who really understands math and physics really well, right? And so and you need that as a first cause, and that to me is the differentiator between a first cause, which is a universe, which is actually an argument in going around in circles, because we're asking the question who created the universe, and can't say the universe created the universe, right? So we know God is personal. We know he's scientific. We know he's very smart. He set things up the way he said it. Now, part of Einstein's theory of relativity pointed to the fact that not only was space created at that point, but time was created at that point as well. So there was no such thing as time before that. So eternity then is really timelessness. Time as a concept didn't exist, right? Now it's hard for us to grasp, obviously, right? But we're trying to describe an infinite God with our finite minds and finite words that we can use to describe it. And there is some limitation there, obviously. That limitation being on our side, though, the limitation is not on God's side.
Can I one last thing before this? And I do want to go to origin of life because I know that that's more directly related to the chemical engineering and that type of thing. And I really want to get into that in a second. But
Yeah,
while we're on this topic, I know for sure, just as a matter of, based on the number of people watching this video, there will certainly be some people who are thinking of the old Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Douglas Adams analogy. And I have a quote here I just want to read because people always go to this, and I kind of want to give you the chance to speak into how this doesn't necessarily address kind of what you're saying, but I want to give you a chance to kind of explain why, because I think people just
sure.
have in their mind that what I'm about to read answers the fine tuning or the someone monkeyed with the laws of physics and chemistry that
Right.
you described. So, but here's what people I think I hear often defaulting to, and here it is. This is rather as if you imagine a puddle waking up one morning and thinking, this is an interesting world I find myself in, an interesting hole I find myself in. Fits me rather neatly, doesn't it? In fact, it fits me staggeringly well. Must have been made to have me in it. And so that idea is basically that we're the beneficiaries of randomness that has happened to benefit us. So we have the viewpoint that it's designed and it's special and it's handcrafted, but really it's just that we're extremely lucky and
Right.
there's nothing else to it. So how would you respond to something like that?
Yeah. So uh, uh, and I think it's called the anthropic principle. By the way, the answer to any question from Douglas Adams is 42. Okay, so just so you know.
Exactly, exactly.
So now that we know the answer, we got to figure out what the question is. All right. And so, and Dawkins and others talk about it. It's not that the universe or even the biological systems are designed, they just appear to be designed. All right. But in a sense, they're saying the effects are there. It does look designed, right? The only question was, does it look designed because it was designed, or does it look designed because of randomness? Right? To me, randomness is it's not just that it's a poor explanation. To me, it's the lack of an explanation, right? Because if I ask you why did something happen, right, and you say it just randomly happened, you didn't explain anything. You're just saying I don't know why it happened, right? Now there are times when maybe things are truly random, and but if I reason by analogy for a second, because obviously everybody is not a physicist or a biologist and so on, right? If you and I fly to Mars tomorrow, right? And the first thing, and we are looking to see is their life, right? And now, usually, what people look for is just to say, is there even water, right? If
Hmm.
there's water, there should be life because they assume if there's water, there is life, which is obviously not true, right? You could
Hmm.
have hydrochloric acid in the water and you certainly don't have any life, right?
Hmm.
But what we first thing we find when we get out there is there's an iPhone, which is functional, which works. I think that's sufficient for you and me to conclude that there is intelligent life on there, whether or not we see the intelligent life, right? The reason is this: the iPhone is not only it looks designed, you have to think of what all needs to happen for that iPhone to be functional, right? You need a whole semiconductor industry, you need a wireless communications industry, you need material science, you need electricity, you need so many things to work before you can have the iPhone,
Hmm.
right? So it's not that a whole bunch of components just came together. Each component itself takes a whole industry to put together, right? So the number of things which have to happen before this can happen is sky high,
And
right?
correct me if I'm wrong, but a cell is more complicated than an iPhone.
Dramatically more complicated than an iPhone. I mean, I'd like to see a self-replicating iPhone, and then maybe we can talk about levels of complexity, right? And so it's a city in itself. It's a country in itself. It's got its own defenses. It's got its own borders. It's got its own waste management systems, electrical systems, right, for transmission of sensation and so on. It has systems to say, I have low oxygen, I have too much oxygen, I have poison coming in. How do I deal with the poison? All of this, and it can self-replicate, right?
And can we talk for a second about that self-replication? Because I think this is something that is easily taken for granted, but should not be. I remember, and I'm not a scientist, but I remember in a biology class in college, they were describing the mRNA and the way that DNA replicates and the way that the letters combine together. And it was just a explanation of the what is happening. This is doing
Right.
this, that is going there.
Right.
This is what is happening, and this is how it's happening. And I remember raising my hand and basically asking the question, how does it know how to do what it's doing?
Right.
How is it what is directing that C to connect to that G? How does it know where to go and what to do? What is even propelling the movement? How does it have the knowledge to know how to replicate that cell, or how does that turn into a liver cell, a brain cell? How does it know basically,
Right.
and what's moving it all? And the professor was like, well, that's something that we don't really have figured out yet, but just give it some time and we'll
Yeah.
get there. And I was just like, this is crazy. Like
I know.
it's this extremely complicated thing that has every single marker of prior input as if it had been designed or programmed to do so. So
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I'll let you take it from there because this is more in
Uh,
line with your expertise.
uh,
But
I'll take a shot at it, right? So obviously, it's not an easy question to answer. How does it know when to replicate? How what cell it should become, and so on. I think the words we use to describe a DNA are probably off. The terms we use usually is it's a blueprint, right? And so that's the design, and boom, everything else is just a copy machine, and it follows that design, right? A better way to describe it is it's a library, right? It's a library of knowledge from which different proteins can be made, different, whatever you want, different things to be made is made from that library. So that knowledge is somehow stored within DNA, right? Um, how does it know when to make what? Great question. I mean, that's part lots of things that we don't understand, right? And but I'm curious, where did this knowledge come from? Right? I mean, we're talking about library of books. You see a library of books behind me, right? I mean, people wrote the books. No one thinks that randomly some ink was created and fell on paper and was converted into books, right? That's how evolution thinks of, the creation of the first cell, right? The origin of the first cells. I mean, why do the different, I mean, it's a four-letter alphabet we're dealing with, right? Rather than a 26-letter alphabet in English, the DNA code is in four-letter alphabet, right?
mhm,
But just like in English, the letters could be set up any which way, right? It's not that one letter causes another letter to follow it.
mhm,
It's the meaning of the words and sentences which you're interested in. And it's the same thing with the DNA. It's not like the one amino acid is always going to be connected to another, or one of those, the A, G, C, and T, right? The in the information language is always connected to the same one. It's like
mhm.
they could be connected in different ways, and you have all these different words and all these different sentences. And so the library comes from somewhere, and
Right,
the only place we've seen library of information come from is from intelligent minds, right?
right. Absolutely. And can I just say this because I think that what you're saying is so important for people to understand because there's a straw man presentation of what Christian believers believe, which is that it's as if it's projected onto us that we are totally throwing out all of what is known in science and all of these mechanisms and the way that these things really work. And we're just saying, no, 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 God did it. And we don't need to think about anything else. And I strongly reject that way of framing Christian thought.
Right.
The distinction that you and I are drawing is yes, we can see the how.
Right.
We're just adding a layer onto this riddle
Right.
of where did that original knowledge base come from? To use your,
Correct.
am I getting that right? To use your
Yeah,
library
absolutely.
analogy, where did the beginning knowledge come from?
Right.
Because and Christians have different opinions about evolution, microevolution, macroevolution, common ancestor. This is something
Right.
that is debated within Christian circles. But wherever you stand on that conversation, the way more significant point. I love, and I'm going to turn this back to you in a second, but I love Madeline L. Ingle. While we're kind of going into literature with Douglas Adams, Madeline L. Ingle, Wrinkle in Time, was asked this question, and I love her response because she said the only truly important question within this is, did God do it? Because if
Right.
he did, if God is behind everything that is, then we live in a universe of intentionality and we live in a universe of wonder. And if he didn't, then we're all going to be gone in a relatively near future and nothing is lasting or meaningful. There's no justice. There's no hope. She goes off on this really cool rant explaining that's the critical point. Is there an architect or is there
Exactly.
not? Take it away.
100%. And that's one of the things which I found extremely interesting is if there is God, there is meaning, right? He's created us for a purpose. You and me, we may not know what the purpose is today, but there is a purpose, and that's for us to discover, right? And but if there is no God, ultimately, and I think it's Dawkins who says this, ultimately there is no purpose. There is just pitiless indifference, right? And so it becomes a huge question. And I think asking the questions as saying, where did this information come from, actually opens up new areas of science instead of shutting down it science to say, okay, God did it. There's nothing else to discover,
Right.
right? We are opening up new areas of science saying, how did this library come about? And it tells us a lot about the nature of God, but it also tells us that, you know, we can know God in different ways, right? And one way certainly is science, right? That's what I
Mhm.
found attractive is to say, ultimately, it's a chase for the truth, right? I'm looking
Mhm.
for the truth. Now, Jesus said something super interesting. He said, I am the truth, right? So he went from truth as a concept to truth as a person, right? So truth as a concept actually flows out of his nature as of truth as a person, you know. And so we're really looking to expand science, I think, saying that tells us more and it doesn't tell us less, right?
I'm at a fork in the road right now in my mind. I'm wanting to go the direction of basically what Stephen Meyer has been talking about, how actually and the thesis that intelligence is behind science is actually leading intelligent design proponents into new discoveries by beginning with
Right.
that rather than the alternative. So if you have anything to say about that, mentally note that, and then either avoid it or whatnot. But I also want to get to what you were just saying about Jesus, and I'm so curious about your perspective about Jesus as a Hindu, as an atheist, and then as a Christian. How was your view of him, and how did it change across each of those epochs of your life?
Okay. So, as Yogi Berra says, if you come to a fork in the road, take it. So we will take it. And we'll take the second one first, maybe,
Okay, great.
and then come back to the first one. My perception of Jesus as a Hindu, I simply thought religion was what you are born with, right? Whatever kind of family you grew up with. So some people are born as Christians, some people are born as Hindus, right? I do find it really funny. This is a tangent. I find it funny. I get a lot of grief sometimes from people who don't like the fact that I have become a Christian and said, your religion is determined at birth and it is determined by your family, right? Where you're born, right? And I say, you're not even sure that sex and gender is determined at birth, and you want to tell me that religion is determined at birth, right? So, if you ask me, it's the other way. Sex and gender is defined at birth, and religion it's a idea, it's a worldview, and like all worldviews, should be open to questions, right? And be able to answer things. So, but as a Hindu, I simply thought religion is cultural and everybody was simply there. So I didn't think much of Jesus. I really didn't understand why would he hang on the cross for me, right? Now, Hindu religion is often very mythological. There's lots of stories and so on. And so, I thought, okay, Christianity is like that, right? As an atheist, I felt no need for. I didn't spend much time thinking about Jesus or Christianity or any of those. Science answered my questions, right? But again, dependent on the depth of my question, if I started getting deep into saying why are things like that, why do we even have laws? right? Why is there a law of physics? You know, um, then science didn't answer those questions. It just said, here is the law. Here is the law of gravity. Well, why is there gravity, right? And it's a bigger question than most people think, because when Newton proposed the law of gravity, and it says it's the force between two masses, right, as Newton envisioned it, people struggle with that concept because you're talking about two masses which are not even touching each other, and you're saying one of them exerts a force on the other one.
Hmm.
How does that happen? They're not even in physical contact with each other, right? And his perception was a little bit theistic. He said, somehow God is involved in this process. He didn't know how to explain it fully himself, right? And obviously, we also don't know. In fact, no one knows how to explain gravity, right? I mean, we know how to measure it, maybe, say, but why is there gravity, right? Einstein looked at gravity a little bit differently and said, big masses curve space. But why do they curve space? Right? Who made that rule? Right? So we don't understand why things are the way they are. Right? So, but at that point, as a atheist, I didn't think about that. Just that it answered a lot of my questions and it was logical. It wasn't until I met three people. All of them were extremely smart intellectually. One of them was a professor at Yale, one of them was a civil engineer, and one of them was a lawyer, right? So none of them are dummies, all right? All of them trained to think very logically,
Hmm.
and all of them were Christians, right? And I was shocked. It's like, I mean, to me, that was different from my atheistic world, you know? And so, but it got me curious enough to understand, I wonder why they are Christians. And let me give it a shot to say, uh, is there anything here? Right.
Hmm.
And then when I started looking at the life of Jesus, but, probably most importantly at that point, the resurrection of Jesus, I saw that this was it. I could actually look at it scientifically. I could explore the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, which I think we can both agree is a super unlikely event, right? It doesn't happen normally, right? In fact, we know of no one else, right? Other than Jesus and some people around him, like Lazarus and so on, but essentially Jesus. So, my obvious starting point for Jesus as I was exploring it was, this doesn't happen. This seems super unlikely, right? But let me look at the evidence, right? Because there's at least three smart people I know who think it happened, you know.
Hmm.
And as I started looking at that evidence, I found it to be actually pretty solid, right? And I started thinking over it and say, why do I then struggle to think the resurrection could have happened, right? And I realized I had an a priori assumption.
Hmm.
The a priori assumption was there is no God. If there is no God, then, I don't see how there could be a resurrection. But if there's a possibility that there is God, right?
Hmm.
I'm not saying it's a given, but if there's a possibility that there is God, then he who's given us life to begin with, is not that hard to put back life in a body which has died, right?
Right.
So then I started saying, okay, let me remove my a priori assumption and say, I don't know if there's a God or there is no God. I'm just going to look at the evidence, right? And I found that evidence to be super strong. If you want, we can go through that as well. Now we're at another point, but
Yeah, I
I'll
think
follow
I
you
think
later.
that and I'm remembering your Yogi Bear quote, so we'll eventually get there. But I think that that would be good to do. And if I might just add a little bit of framing to this before you, and I'm actually curious to hear what stood out to you in particular and how was that used in your story. But I think that it's important to note that the type of evidence that we're talking about is of a
Correct.
historic nature
Correct.
because this happened as an event in history.
Right.
And I'm actually curious to get your thoughts on this as well. I was talking with someone just in the comment section a few days ago, and I asked the question, um, theoretically, let's say that it did happen. What would you consider to be evidence?
Right.
given that it happened in history. I mean, there wasn't.
Right.
Did you see? You understand what I'm saying? So, anyways,
I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
anyways, I'll if any of that's helpful as just leading into it or framing it,
Right. Right.
go take it away.
Right. So the evidence, as I looked at it, was one. We know Jesus was on the cross. Okay. There is evidence from the Christians in the New Testament. There's evidence from the Jews, right? There's evidence from the Romans. He was on the cross. We know that what he died of. Okay, he died essentially of a heart attack because your heart cannot pump any more blood. The CO2 concentration keeps going up, and we know that there was a spear stuck into the side of on his side, and they saw blood and water. Why that's important is that's an indication of pericardial effusion. Right now, normally, if you're just making up stuff, you would only think of blood. You wouldn't know to say it's blood and water, but there's both blood and water indicating how he died, right? Um, we know he was buried, right? We know there was a big stone in front of the tomb. The way we know that, and I'll try and only look at hostile evidence and not Christian evidence on this. We know this because when the tomb was found empty, right? So we know that there was a seal put on the rock with a legion of soldiers. Usually that's 16 soldiers, and there's a seal of the Roman emperor, which is a wax seal on a rope, so you can't remove the rock. We know that the rock was thrown far away, and the initial reaction of the Jews and was that the soldiers fell asleep, right? Well, the fact that they're saying the soldiers fell asleep at least admits the fact that there were soldiers, right? And they had account for the fact that the tomb was empty, right? So that is one side of it, right? So
Yeah.
definitely on Sunday morning, the tomb was empty. Everybody agrees. Nobody thinks anything else happened, right? The only question was how was the tomb empty? And does that actually indicate a resurrection, right? So the Jews believed in one God, right? And suddenly they went within 50 days on the day of the Pentecost. They went from to about 3,000 people following Christ. Now, to them, following anyone who was not God would be blasphemy, leading straight to hell. So it was not a gradual change in religious beliefs and thoughts. It was instantaneous, virtually, right? And so we had to explain that if that didn't happen and they didn't see the resurrected Christ themselves with their eyes, why did it change and 3,000 people go that way, right? Back to your question about if it had not happened, what would it look like, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is how you look at historical evidence rather than physics or chemistry lab experiments, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say Jesus didn't rise from the dead. What led 3,000 people instantly to change their mind and go in a different direction? They did not get more power. They did not get more money. In fact, most of the time they were persecuted and killed and martyred, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they went forward. So what they were testifying to when they say they saw the resurrected Christ, and over 500 people saw him, right? Including hostile evidence. Paul is a great example of someone who was persecuting the Christians who turned around and ended up writing 25% of the New Testament, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think God had a very specific purpose for Paul because Paul, remember, had read under Gamaliel. He was
Mm-hmm.
your Harvard graduate essentially, right? The rest
Right.
of them were fishermen, right? So they didn't always have the background in Old Testament to explain that the Christ is the Messiah through the prophetic message in the Old Testament. Well, Paul did.
Yes. Can I just say really quick too, as a parenthetical, that I was actually watching a video literally last night where a skeptical person was sort of trying to debunk the validity of Paul by showing the amount of times that he references or paraphrases or quotes from Greco-Roman thinkers. And he was saying, look at this, Paul is a copycat. Paul is a copycat. But all that I could see was the blueprint that was also given to us in Acts chapter 17, where he looks at the engraving of the image of the unknown God
Right.
that they would have understood, and then uses that to build a bridge in their imagination, in their cultural imagination,
Absolutely.
to Jesus. And the
Right.
more the skeptical guy's video was actually awesome, because I was like, thank you, bro. You've taken all the time to show us how
Right.
genius Paul was at
Right.
bringing in Plato and at bringing in all these different Greek philosophers, taking their phraseology and
Right.
then repurposing it so that people would understand that Jesus is he's an unknown God to you, but that is who he truly is, like he said at Areopagus. And there's actually a bunch of other examples where Paul did that very thing. So just to highlight your point, he was a genius in terms of his knowledge of the Jewish tradition, like you said, under Gamaliel, and his knowledge of the Old Testament. But he
Right.
also was extremely knowledgeable about the Greek philosophy of that day.
Yeah. And he started off being the apostle to the Jews, but ended up being the apostle to the Gentiles, right?
Right.
So he needed to speak their language, right? And so he used, their Greco-Roman mythology to point to certain things, and their ways of thinking to point to certain things. But he was just connecting, to use your words, he was building a bridge to them. He was not using the Greco-Roman philosophy as though it was the gospel, right? So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think it was, I forgot who said this, but the idea of gospel contextualizing. I think
Right.
of Donald Richardson when he went to the people of Papua New Guinea, and he was trying to find a metaphor, a way that they would understand what the gospel is and what God has done for them. And he finally figured out the idea of the peace child. And he wrote a book called The Peace Child, where
Right.
he found that they had a cultural practice that the Christian story could plug into. And once those dots connected, the salvation came to the people there. So that's just one
Yeah.
example of that idea of gospel contextualization.
And that's what we are doing as well, right? We are talking to the scientists, to the analytical people who do think from a rational perspective, as you and I do as well, and saying, look, we also thought the same way, and here are some things we found that we had to address, right? So, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
that's why I love your story, because it again kind of throws a wrench into the easy label and dismiss approach that I see often taken, where if you're religious, then you're unthinking. If you're religious, then you believe in superstition and fairy tales or leprechauns and all this stuff.
right.
Unlike us sophisticated modern men. And I love your story because it just totally defies that straw man, or I guess
Yeah.
label and dismiss approach.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people like me who have these questions, right? And if anything, it's so interesting. Scientists are as much of a social tribe as any other tribe, right? I was an atheist as a scientist only because everyone else around me was an atheist. I didn't have to think my way into atheism, right? That was the default position, but I had to think my way out of it, right? And so, and I think it goes to, if anybody is in that boat trying to say, how do I think my way in or out of it? I just want to think and say, yeah, what are top questions you have that need to be answered, right? For me, origin was one of them. Origin of the universe, origin of life, origin of information, right? And those I found I could address, I could only get so far with the science, and then said there is something beyond the science to explain the foundations of science.
Absolutely. Now, I thought it was a parenthetical, but did I actually derail your train when I came in with the Pauline epiphany that I had that I was so excited about?
You didn't derail me, but to get back to it, so we were talking about the evidence for the resurrection,
Yeah.
right? So there were 500 eyewitnesses, right? We know there were hostile ones. We talked about Paul. There were other ones. Thomas, the doubting Thomas, did not believe either. He wasn't hostile, but he didn't think there was resurrection was actually true, right? So he said, "I need to feel the scars and etc. before I will believe." There was one of the James, the brother of Jesus, who had at one point said Jesus is, filled with the devil, for example, and was not trusting of Jesus, who turned around and became a bond servant of Jesus, right? And so if you look at the people, the apostles, 11 out of the 12 apostles were martyred, right? A lot of the disciples were martyred. Now, here is the interesting thing. What were they martyred for? right? And it was not their belief. It's not that they had the wrong belief and they were killed for that belief. They were not standing up for their beliefs. They're standing up for what they saw, right? That's the difference, because people may die for their beliefs all day long, right? But they're saying, this is what I saw. And if you're going to kill me for testifying that this is what I saw, kill me, because you can kill me, but you can't hurt me, right? And so that's so their testimony is strong because of the fact that what they got for their testimony was really usually getting martyred. It was not money or position or whatever else normally drives people, right? So why are they getting martyred? Why didn't they back off and say, yeah, actually I didn't see it, I was just saying stuff, right? Why did they stand up and say, no, this is my testimony and this is what I saw, and nothing you can do will get me to change my testimony? Well, because that they couldn't deny it to themselves. That's the thing. And so hence they couldn't deny it to anyone else, right? So to me, I found that testimony very strong. And then as I reflected on that and said, you know, the evidence for the resurrection is very good. I think it is not. I mean, I really didn't go in expecting to get to that conclusion, right? And but when I got to that conclusion, I said, and if that is the case, then Jesus makes the case that he is God, right? And yeah, so then that led on to a lot of other things then I had to sort out. So once I was convinced of that, then even if there are other things I didn't fully understand, it still fit under this framework of saying I understand the big thing, I may not understand the details subsequently beneath it.
Now, this part I have to add an asterisk in front of, but I would also say that your life and my life are a part of the evidence of the resurrection.
Absolutely.
In a different way, in a less historic way, but I think that we have undervalued personal knowledge. And when you have personal knowledge of a revelatory nature times millions of people across time claiming something that's so outrageous and audacious that we have come to know a person, that we have come to know God in Christ. I just think that the radical nature of the Christian claim needs to be looked at. You're not just saying you changed your mind and stepped into a different belief system. You're saying, Christians are saying that we know what it's like to be lost and we know what it's like to be found. We know what it's like to be blind and we know what it's like to see, that we have actually come to know God in Christ.
Right. And you make a great point, and John Lennox makes this point as well, and says Christianity is something to be experienced, not just understood, right?
Right.
And so it's a totally different experience. And the apostles were not the only ones who are, in a sense, martyred for their belief, right? It's not that you or I get a whole lot out of standing up and saying, "Here's who I follow," except a bunch of abuse most of the time, right? But abuse or not abuse doesn't matter, because that's the nature of truth, right? It's difficult to deny it, right?
Yeah.
So to your point, we are also that resurrection, right? And that's something I wish actually is more reflected in how we as Christians live as well, right? Is to say, I mean, the calling is great, right? But the calling is not to money, and calling is not to health. It's not the prosperity gospel. The calling is to sacrifice, right? The calling is to live a life in a relationship with God in a way whose reward, ironically, not being money, or is actually joy and peace and patience and love, and what we call the fruits of the spirit, right? That's the promise. It's not the money and the health necessarily, right?
I think that there's one last elephant in the room that I want to tackle with the remaining time that we have, which is that I think a lot of people would listen to our conversation and they're thinking probably about your family, your community, the context that you were raised in, and how, well, good for you, according to Christianity, you found your way to the truth, to the capital T truth, and you now believe that you have the ticket to heaven through Jesus. But what about everybody that you were raised with? And so it's sort of the unreached people group question, or the
Mhm.
idea that geography presents this huge disadvantage. I'm curious for you, as someone who has actually come from India, come out of Hinduism, to what extent do you see that as being true? How much uh, mental furniture is in place where the people that you grew up with would be able to understand the gospel? Or to what extent do you feel that being born there is truly a disadvantage compared with being born in America? And how do you see yourself? I guess I'm asking you a bunch of
Uh,
questions, but I hope you can
Yeah,
see where I'm
yeah,
getting at with this. How do you see
yeah.
yourself as a person come out of Hinduism through atheism into Christianity? And now with the Christian doctrine that he who has the son has life, he who does not have the son does not have life. How do you look at Hinduism in your hometown?
So it's possible that somebody in a different geographical region and in some area don't see the same light as we see, right? Let's say, but they certainly feel the same darkness that we felt, right? So in a sense, none is left with an excuse, right? And if it is that we saw light, it is not because geographically we were in some place. It is the fact that we did sense the darkness, right? And we were looking for some kind of light, not necessarily knowing what that answer was, right? I do think the Holy Spirit works on everyone's heart, right? And now whether they respond to it is a different thing. And I've seen people, the Holy Spirit also, kind of like how Paul was, reaches out in a way which is consistent with where people are, right? So
Mm-hmm.
since I was rational and scientific, the way I connected was rational and scientific. But I know lots of people who connected through angelic visions, for example, right? Because they come from a background where angels is part of their way of thinking. Now, I have never had an angelic vision, and I wouldn't know what to do if I had one, right? But that's because my mindset is different, and God reached me differently than He would reach somebody else, right? Now, in terms of people who maybe never heard the gospel and so on, well, I think that responsibility lies with us, right? He's given us a purpose to go share what is our greatest reward in a sense, right? With others. So, uh, what he will do with people who never hear the gospel, we know he's a God of righteousness, and we have to
Mm-hmm.
trust him eventually on how he will deal with it, right? But on the other hand, whether they see the light or not, I think people see the darkness, and certainly the means to reach out to find the light is increasingly accessible to people, I think.
I love what you said about that God is a God of justice, because I think that when people look at the unreached people group question, it's easy to say, well, this is obviously unjust. This is
Right.
obviously unrighteous. But it sounds to me like what you're pointing to sort of adjacently is everything that God has done to reach out to people, to redeem people, to offer hope to people, to offer mercy to people. And it's sort of like looking through the lens of what God has done at the question of how does he go about dealing with each individual person in a just and righteous manner,
Right.
regardless of geography.
Right.
Maybe we don't fully know the answer to that question, but we know, to your thing, it will be righteous in light of what we know that he has done for people. Is that, do you see it the same way, or
Yeah,
how?
absolutely. I mean, he didn't have to redeem any of us, right? He came incarnate to redeem us. So
Mm-hmm.
he's already walked a million miles, and our question is really, will he walk one more mile to reach the people who have not heard him, right? But the very fact that he's walked a million miles to redeem us shows us he's a God who's trying to bring people into heaven, not trying to push them into hell, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
so when we look from that perspective, he's not trying to push people who haven't heard him into hell. He's using us, and he's using, and the Holy Spirit works on people's heart to turn towards him, right? The exact mechanics of every bit we may not know or we don't fully get, right? But the heart of the person doing it, we know very well.
Okay, last question, I promise.
Yeah.
When you're talking about the universally shared experience of knowledge of the darkness, can you unpack that a little bit and share what that was for you? And then can you share a little bit about what was your first glimpse of God in Christ that you saw the beauty and that you responded to? I'm just curious at what point you went from I'm done with religion, I'm a man of science to wait, there's something here that's calling to me within Jesus. And I'm just curious what that was in particular.
The first darkness that I saw was in India, the caste system, right? I found it fundamentally unjust because we were classifying people based on their birth, saying you are either a priest or you're the highest caste or you're the lowest caste. And there's four big ones, but there's a million other subcastes and so on. Now, I happen to be in the highest caste, right? But something fundamentally seemed wrong about the fact that the value of people is based on their caste, right? So that to me, and I saw so much arguments and violence and everything else in India growing up based simply on this one thing, right? Um, when I became an atheist, that's one of the things which led me towards atheism is say, hey, everyone is created equal or everyone is equal. I didn't think about anyone being created, but everyone is equal and forget the caste system. It has no place in a civilized society, right? And then I began to see that, science created its own caste systems. We have the elites, right? We have the, back to your point, people who think they think they're the only ones who think scientifically, and anyone else who's religious is not scientific, and so on. Uh, so when began to learn about Jesus, the thing which amazed me was how it balanced law with grace, right? Meaning it was very clear there's a law, there's a right, there's a wrong. So there was a moral framework, but clearly we all, and I'll speak for myself, often fail in that moral framework. So we just like the moral framework for other people. So I want you to follow the moral framework and don't steal my stuff. But if I accidentally pick up your stuff, oh, I just took it, I was borrowing it and I'm going to return it, right? Or if I lied about you, it's like, well, I didn't say it, it didn't come out correctly. Well, I may have just lied about you and violated the moral framework, right? So we like the moral framework for others, but we can't keep it ourselves. And but there was grace as well, and that grace was simply to say we didn't meet the moral standards. But before there were rules, there were relationships, right? And so that relationship and saying, well, God is a person, first of all, or maybe, Christian theology, three persons, right?
Hmm.
And but he's a person who knows me and he's a person who wants me to come back in relationship with him before we start fixing all the moral problems, right? And that walk with him is where I may still have moral problems, right? But obviously on a walk with Christ one would assume that we start making changes, right? It's a life experienced, right? And so that was what I saw as that balance of the moral framework as well as a grace as we fail within that moral framework.
I think that's so well said. I can't help but quote a few scriptures. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. As we were nailing him to the cross, he was saying, forgive them, Father, they don't know what they do.
Right.
And when he in the Sermon on the Mount talks about if someone hits you on the right cheek, which is a backhand,
Right.
turn your cheek, face your attacker squarely, look him in the eyes, maintaining the connection.
Right.
And that's what Christ has done towards all of us. We've
Yeah.
all backhanded him continuously throughout life.
Right.
And there's no one who has gone so far that he's not willing to follow them there. The ground is
Right.
level at the foot of the cross. And I think what you've said is amazing.
Right. And so to that, point. So then when we debate with our scientific friends and skeptical friends, the bottom line is they're our friends and they're our brothers, right? They're not our enemies to where we want to win a debate. Winning the debate means nothing, right? It is for us the ability to share what we consider the most valuable part of our lives, right? And hopefully they see it the same way, right?
That's a great note to end on too, because I'm always we're in an odd position of pleading with people. You're valuable, you're
Right.
loved, you're
Right.
intended to exist. You're not an accident. You're not just a monkey. You're not just stardust. You are beloved. And it's a funny thing to be wanting to share, but we I think share it because we've come to know him, ultimate reality, and that makes you want to share it. Just like have you seen an amazing movie, you're like, you guys have to see this. And I think that's
Right.
part of what is in the Christian heart, but a lot of times it gets extrapolated down as what you're doing is wrong, you're in trouble, we don't like you, you need to believe what we believe. And there's this judgmentalism or something that gets
Right.
mixed in there. But I think that your heart and tone I can hear and feel, and I feel the same way. It's just that we've looked and we've found, and there's no one like Jesus. We want to share that with people who think that sounds like the craziest thing ever.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Thank you for having me on here. I appreciate you. I watched for a long time the videos you put together. It's a great skill you bring, a skill I wish I had, by the way. So on how to get to the essence of a question and bring it out. So I appreciate what you have done, and hopefully you'll keep doing lots of these.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on the program. Thanks for reaching out like you did. And what can, by way of outro, how can people reach you, find you? Do you have books, podcasts? What do you got to share here at the end?
Yeah. So about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, I started writing a book called Let Me Into Heaven. And it was really being an analytical guy. I really wanted to know what heaven is like. Is was a big question for me, and what kind of food, right? And are the
What?
steaks, or the beef kebab? That was what I was trying to answer. And do we have bodies? I mean, that's the eternal reward, but most of us don't know how to describe that eternal reward. And if you ask the average Christian, what is heaven like? Let's say it's like a really long church service, right? Okay, that's great. I can stand music for 10 minutes, but not for eternity, right? But no eye has conceived, right? No eye has seen or no mind conceived what heaven's going to be like, right? But there are hints biblically, and that's what I wanted to get to. And then I realized I'm not the only one who's probably interested in this topic. So I ended up writing a book called Let Me Into Heaven. So people can go to my website. My goal again, it's not that book is a money making thing. For me, it's a way to have a discussion and convey an idea. So people can go to my website, letmeintoheaven.com, and they will be able to, we can dialogue over there, right? I am on YouTube and Instagram. I wrote the book under a pseudonym, which was my initials, GV. So I called it GVs. My daughter, who's also a GV, did the illustration for the book. So we called it the GVs, which is spelled GEEVES. So I'm on Instagram and YouTube under GVs Official, or on Twitter under the name cos_first, like a first cos, but reversed. But if you can't remember all that, go to letmeintoheaven.com. You'll find the links there and so on. Again, my goal
Great.
is to provide information and hopefully give you something to think about.
That's great. I'll put a link to your book in the description of this video as well for those who are interested. And we'll have to talk offline as well. I want to get you into the Wisdom Society as well. We're having a good time
Okay,
in there talking with people from around the world. It's been really good so far, and I'd love to
absolutely.
join you in
Yeah.
that conversation. So,
I don't know what that society is, but I'd love to
oh,
find out more.
yeah, it's something I've just created to allow the audience to connect with us, to connect with each other and have a deeper dialogue. And we're also doing a book club
Okay.
where we're right now reading Paul Copan's book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? And then Dr. Copan is going to join us in a Zoom call at the end of the month and answer all the hard questions in like a live Q&A
Awesome.
there on the website. So yeah, I'll put a link to that as well. And I'd like to get you involved with that to the extent that you're
I'd
willing
love
to.
that. I'd
Okay,
love that.
awesome. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Ganesh. This was a great
Thank
chat.
you. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, talk soon. Bye.
It's okay. Bye.